So back in the 1970s, my mum was a teenager living in Houston. She and her 9 siblings lived in the Heights, which she says is a nice neighbourhood now, but at the time was something of a slum. Her family was super poor. Anyway, my mum had a crush on one of her brother's friends. She was around 14 or 15 at the time, and he was a few years older. But she was in love. His name was Mark. Well, around this time, boys started disappearing from the neighbourhood. They weren't leaving notes or telling anyone that they were leaving. Their families were calling the police, but the police weren't doing anything about it. They decided that the boys had run away and never really looked into it any further. After all, these were poor kids living in a bad neighbourhood. They ran away all the time. Life goes on. One day, Mark disappears too. Meanwhile, my mum's brother was hitching a ride out to the beach to go fishing. He did this on a regular basis and would bum a ride from anyone. On the way to the beach, the guy driving the car stops to fill up the gas tank. The guy working at the gas station, Mum says they called him Weird Larry, sees my uncle and asks who he's with. My uncle replies that he doesn't actually know the guy. Larry won't let my uncle go any further and makes him get out of the car. The driver goes on without him. Now then, 3 years have passed since the boys started disappearing, and they finally find out what happened. A man had been paying 2 boys to lure teenage boys to his house, where he drugged them, strapped them to a wooden board, tortured them, raped them, and then killed them. There were at least 28 victims, and Mark Scott was one of them. The only reason they found out was because the 2 teenagers murdered the serial killer, then told the police all about the murders and led them to some of the bodies. And guess who picked up my uncle that day when he was going fishing? About 10 years ago, I was recently divorced and living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. The place was clean and the rent was decent. One of those places that had a doorman. I felt safe here. I was alone and loving it, focused on my career and not on my clingy ex-husband. Things were finally looking up for me. At the time, I was working pretty late at the office and would often stumble into my apartment, sleep deprived, in the early hours of the morning and wake up by 6:30, 7ish to start the day. I started noticing that in the morning my door would be unlocked sometimes. I usually dismissed this as my sleep-dead brain, thinking that the bed was more appealing than locking the door. Another thing that I noticed since moving in was that I seemed to misplace things more than I used to. Little things like a hairbrush or nail polish, that sort of thing. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just enough to be a slight annoyance to my day. The longer I lived there, the more frequently I seemed to forget to lock the door. At first it was every once in a while, then it seemed like an almost daily occurrence. More things went missing. Things like pictures, shaving razors, and more disturbingly, my underwear. This went on for long enough, then I started to get a little paranoid. I started to take the time at night to make sure the door was locked. I got into the habit of every night after I locked the door to turn the handle 3 times and say to myself, "It's locked, it's locked, it's locked." Time after time, I would wake up and the door would be unlocked. One time, I even tried staying up all night to watch my door, but I ended up falling asleep in the chair. I decided that my mind was not reliable enough to stay up all night, so I invested in a video camera. I went all out and bought the fanciest camera that I could get my hands on. So one night, I set the camera up facing the door. I hid the camera under a pile of towels on the floor. I locked the door and went to bed. When I woke up, my apartment looked normal, nothing missing that I could see. I decided to check the tape. I fast-forwarded through the hours of the footage, not seeing anything. I was just about to give up when I noticed the handle of the door jitter. Then, it slowly crept open. A figure slid through the half-open door and walked towards the camera. It paused, looked around as if it was listening for something, then walked forward into the direct view of the camera. I paused the camera. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to rise. I was staring directly into the face of the maintenance man of the building. I could see those big, thick glasses and curly hair. I had no doubt who it was. I played the tape a little more. He looked quite comfortable as he walked around the apartment. Then he turned and walked towards my bedroom and out of view of the camera. I didn't know what to do. Sobbing, I called the police. I tried to explain over the phone, but I couldn't. Soon enough, 2 officers arrived on my doorstep. I told them everything and showed them the tape. I remember seeing the blood drain from their faces. They promised me that I was safe and that they were going to get this guy. I needed to lay down, but I didn't want to be alone. One of the officers offered to stand outside my apartment door as I took a nap. As I was laying down in my bed, unable to sleep but too drained to move, something kept nagging at me. I laid there for a few more minutes, tossing and turning, unable to get comfortable or rest. My mind began racing. Then a realization slowly washed over me and chilled me to the bone. We watched the tape and saw the man enter my home, but we never saw him leave. I froze, then started shaking. I needed to get to the front door. I sat up and looked around the room. I couldn't see anyone. I swung my legs over the side of the bed cautiously. My feet hit the cold wood floor, and I felt warm breath on my ankles. I raced out of the apartment as fast as I could and to the safety of the police officer. He called for backup. They found the man under my bed, clutching a knife and a Polaroid camera. I was out hunting in northern Ontario. No roads except for a logging road within 130 kilometres. I was late on the bear season, so no one was out hunting in my quadrant. I found a nice little campsite along the river and hunted from there. On the second day of my hunt, I came across bear tracks and I tracked it for about 2 hours, then turned round. This is when shit got fucking weird. I always track on one side of the tracks and return on the other. Around 200 metres down the east side of the tracks, I ran into another human footprint, which disappeared across the trail and into the woods on the west. My dog, Czech wolf dog, didn't seem to smell anything, so I returned to camp with minimal concern. I got back to camp around 7:30 at night, made a quick dinner and had a cigar by the camp. At around 12, I heard a snap of a branch. After nearly hunting for 20 years, only 2 things snap branches: bears and humans. I grabbed my flashlight and a firearm and went outside after the noise. Every 100 yards, I would scan with the flashlight. My dog started to freak out, growling and then advancing into the woods slowly. I pulled back on the leash to slow his advance and switched on my flashlight. I saw a pair of eyes looking right back at me. It stared for about 5 seconds and then disappeared into the woods. On the walk back, I felt really anxious and scared and uncomfortable. I could feel someone watching me. The next night, the same thing happened. My dog went wild, like I had never seen him. He was whimpering, growling, and clearly very anxious. At this point, I was terrified. I didn't go hunting that day and didn't close my eyes once. That night, I sat up with my flashlight, constantly scanning the tree line. I guess I dozed off around 1 o'clock in the morning and woke up again at 3. I was sweating, really confused and very, very scared. I scanned the forest. Just barely visible about 25 yards in the forest, there was a man and his dog, and he was looking right back at me. I started to approach him, shouting to him. I got to within 10 feet. He looked awfully dishevelled and he really stank. The worst part was that he just stared and smiled. His eyes showed zero emotion. And then he whispered, "Good night." I ran back to my tent, packed it into my pack and loaded it onto the trailer of the ATV, and then drove the hell out of there. This story was told to me by my great aunt, one of my grandmother's 9 sisters. In Cuba, where we're all from, the summers tend to get really hot. Coupled with the lack of air conditioning, because you'd have to be really wealthy to own a unit, people tended to sleep with their doors and windows open. One night, my auntie was putting her grandchildren to sleep. She laid in bed with them, and they were all alone in the home. One of her sisters, Berta, was supposed to be keeping them company tonight, but some last-minute event made her change her mind where she slept that night. My auntie says that sometime around 9 p.m, she noticed a figure who, by her description, must have been at least 7 feet tall. It was human-shaped, but seemed to float inside their home. If it had legs, then they weren't visible because of a long robe of some sort covering them, and dragged along her floor. At this point, rather than scream in fear, my auntie decides to lay perfectly still so not to wake the children. She sees the figure cross the hallway and then head into her room, looming ominously over them. The face she described was that of a pale woman with big red lips and her hair in dreads like that of a Rastafarian man. There were just shadows, cavities as she called it, where her eyes would have been. It left her room through the same way it entered, but didn't leave the house. My aunt's house is large, and she swears she saw the figure go in and out of each room, take about the same amount of time, and then leave. Eventually, the figure ran out of places in the home to visit and simply glided out the front door. My aunt cries to this very day because the next morning, her sister Berta was found dead. Everyone thought it must have been some sort of heart attack or stroke in her sleep because no one heard anything, and they found her where she had laid the night before, only lifeless. My aunt swears the thing must have been death itself, searching for her sister where she should have been. My cousin was in a band and did some touring for a while. He ran into another band from the Illinois area that had a creepy story to tell. They spent their days on the road and didn't make a lot of money, so they always depended on fans to find places to stay. After playing a show, there was a particular fan who seemed really interested. He offered them a place to stay. His parents were really involved in their church and absent from the house. Their band members were kind of curious about this, so they asked him if his parents were on a mission. He just kind of awkwardly smiled and didn't answer the question. Later that night, the band members were getting hungry and thought about raiding the guy's fridge. However, they decided since he was being such a good host that they didn't want to be rude. They packed up the next day and then left. And a few days later, they saw a story on the news about a guy who had killed his parents, chopped them up, and popped them in the freezer. The guy who had been arrested under suspicion was the guy that they had stayed with, and his parents were in the freezer when they talked about raiding the fridge. So, here's a story from my friend. He lives in an apartment complex in the city. The place is about 10 stories high and he lives on the 8th floor. One night, when he was going home, he arrived in the main lobby at around 11 p.m. He waited for the elevator, and when the door opened, a rude man bumped into him and hurriedly walked out of the lobby. My friend didn't think much of it until he got back to his room. As he looked into the bathroom mirror to brush his teeth, he found bits of blood on the very shoulder that the man had bumped. The next day was a Saturday, and he was getting ready for a date. He had just taken a shower when he heard a knock on the door. Peering through the peephole, he saw a policeman. The policeman was a guy in his mid-40s with short dark hair and a shaved-off left eyebrow. The policeman asked through the door, "There was a murder last night at around 10:50 p.m, and I would like to ask if you saw anything in particular." My friend did see something in particular. He bumped into a man that bloodied his shoulder, but he replied, "No, sir, I know nothing of the sort." My friend was already late for his date and didn't want to get involved. The policeman responded, "All right, thank you for your time," and left. My friend went to his date and came back home that day feeling a bit guilty that he'd lied to a police officer. He sat down and flicked on the TV, and the news was talking about the murder at his apartment. Great, he thought, way to make me feel more guilty. But then, the news went on to say that the killer was caught. The culprit's photo came on the screen, and there was the murderer, a guy in his mid-40s with short dark hair and a shaved-off left eyebrow. He wasn't a police officer. He was a man who was out to kill the witnesses. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16 a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day and my sister left to go out too. I live in an average small suburban neighbourhood. I was stuck in the house, bored with my dog, with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I need to open the garage door, because the butt of the air conditioner faces in there and the garage gets overheated. Usually when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room, but this one time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later, in the afternoon, I hear my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed that my sister came home, so I yelled, "It's not locked!" She didn't respond. The doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked in and went to the door, yelling again, "It's not locked!" when the door opened. It felt like slow motion. The door creaked open, a sliver of a crack, and that's all I needed to see. I just saw feet. Huge, dark brown hiking boots of a man, not my sister. I immediately pushed the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it shut and locked it. He started pounding on the door and then it stopped. Hysterically crying and screaming, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. When I went into the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path. Like in the horror movies, with tears streaming down my face, I screamed, "No!" Dog in one hand, knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from being so scared. My weak legs gave out and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor, and I accidentally scratched a long shallow cut on my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This is how I'm going to die. Here in this quiet empty house with my dog as a witness. I held my hand over my mouth to cover me and stop me from being heard when I cried, as I heard the footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats a minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds looking into the window. He stood there for a while and then walked out. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage door is open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog didn't bark and alert me that there was a man trying to break in. I would have been in my room completely unaware until it was too late. My buddy told me this one just the other day. So his sister had 3 friends who went down to Mexico for a fun week of drinking and vacation fun. They were at a bar a night or so before they were supposed to leave, having a good time. And turns out their friend just up and disappeared. Her phone was unresponsive and she had completely vanished from the bar. Well, they were all shit-faced at the time, so the 2 friends just assumed that she'd gone back to the hotel or had ended up with some hot guy or something somewhere. Turns out she wasn't at the hotel. After a lot of commotion, they were driving back towards the US when they are elated to see their friends sitting in a car with a few Mexican gentlemen, a lane or so beside them. Strangely, all efforts to contact her are in vain. They were waving, screaming, and making any kind of commotion, but it all ended up with absolutely zero response from her. They alert the border patrol that their friend who had been missing was spotted in a car along the highway. The border patrol stops the car and investigates. As it turns out, there was a pretty good reason why their friend wasn't acknowledging their presence. Because their friend was dead. But not only were they communicating with their friend's dead corpse, her organs had been completely removed from her body and she had been stuffed to the brim with drugs. Dead. Organs gone, stuffed with drugs. I was pretty fucked up after hearing that part to pry about what happened afterwards. But the image of her friends trying to communicate with their friend's dead body, their same friend that they'd just parted with the night before, chills me to the bone. Okay guys, that's going to do it. That's the end of this video for today. If you like the video, please do consider subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment. I would be very, very grateful to hear what you thought of these stories. Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.